Episode 1. The Huntress. The story begins on June 13, 1980, where there are bloodstains all over the Gore family home. We then jump 2 years earlier, where everyone in Wiley, Texas is gathered at their local church service. It's then that we meet Candy Montgomery and her husband Pat, who seem to be happily married. Another couple in attendance is Betty and Alan Gore. After church, the two get it on at home as they are trying for their second child. Betty has been stressed because it hasn't happened yet and she badly wants another baby. A few days later, everyone gathers for a volleyball match, and while playing, Candy and Alan share a moment on the court. Later that night, Candy tells her friend Sherry that Alan smelled like sex and he turned her on. Candy also says she wouldn't be opposed to having an affair with Alan. Guess Pat isn't getting the job done. After choir practice one night, Candy approaches Alan and she tells him she is infatuated with him and he doesn't know how to react. Nothing happens, but the following day at work, Alan finds himself thinking about Candy a lot. Later, he goes up to her and chats about the possibility of having an affair together. It's a very awkward interaction, to say the least. Alan kisses her but then leaves. A few days later, Alan invites Candy to lunch to talk about their affair arrangements. They both deliberate rules they want to set and not to break. If either of them catches feelings, they need to end it abruptly, as they both are happily married. They meet up at a motel on December 12, 1978 to hook up for the first time. Candy is shocked by how good the sex is and rushes to take a shower so Pat doesn't smell Alan on her, and that's how the episode ends. Episode 2. Encounters. That Sunday at church, the town bids farewell to Pastor Jackie as she is moving on to another job, and they welcome their new pastor, Pastor Ron, and his wife Mary. Betty notices Candy and Alan flirting, but she doesn't make much of it for now. As the week goes on, Candy and Alan continue their hookups, and Alan tells Candy that Mary is pregnant. He feels guilty for not being home with her, but tells Candy he likes having sex with her. About a month later, Alan tells Candy he doesn't feel as bad anymore cheating on Betty because she had cheated on him the year prior, but he stayed with her. He also tells her they will have to pause their hookups for a bit while Betty goes into labor. Candy realizes she is starting to fall for Alan, but doesn't say anything. Alan tells Candy their affair has somehow gotten him and Betty closer. A week later, Betty delivers a baby girl, and they also leave their current church because Betty doesn't care for Pastor Ron. Betty and Alan go out of town, and while Alan is gone, Candy misses him a lot. When they get back to town, Candy meets with him quickly to get it on. When Alan gets home, Betty tries getting jiggy with him, but he turns her down because he is tired. She thinks he doesn't want her anymore after being fat with 2 children. Alan assures her that's not the case, and the following day, he ends things with Candy because he feels guilty. Candy throws a tantrum in the diner and he leaves. Months pass, but then Alan calls Candy to meet for lunch, and he tells her Betty is going through a postpartum episode. He asks her if she will watch his kids while he and Betty go do a marriage counseling encounter since their children are friends. Candy reluctantly says yes. Things go well at the marriage encounter, and Betty and Alan start communicating again and have sex. The following day, they renew their vows and go home. Candy seems to be in a bad mood when she sees them, and then Betty suggests she and Pat go do the same marriage encounter. Candy considers it. Episode 3. Stepping Stone. It's October 1979, and Betty and Alan's marriage seems to be at the highest it ever has been. Candy's daughter, Jenny, tells her mother that Betty and Alan's daughter, Elisa, worries a lot about what other people think and is embarrassed of her parents every now and then. Candy tells this to Alan, and he says not to make much out of it. Teenage girl stuff. Alan does tell Candy that they don't have to end their affair if she doesn't want to, and Candy says it is up to him. He doesn't really answer, and she leaves the ball in his court if he decides he wants to continue, and bounces. Candy moves on and starts a new wallpaper and painting business with Sherry. Meanwhile, at the Gore house, Betty starts experiencing terrible breast pains, and she immediately thinks she has cancer. A few days later, Candy can't resist the temptation and she calls Alan, and he reveals to her Betty is sick. When Alan isn't home the following day, Candy visits Betty to check up on her, and Betty is mad at Alan for telling the private matter to Candy of all people. It ends when Alan gets home. Elsewhere, Candy and Pat decide to attend the same marriage encounter the Gores did. After a bit of reluctance, they do end up opening up to each other while there. When they get back to town, Betty invites Pat and Candy over for dinner and it goes well. Candy goes out of town for a Bible study trip and Pat finds a love letter from Alan to Candy in their home and is heartbroken. When Candy returns, she begs him to stay with her and says the affair is over. He eventually decides to stay with her. A few months pass and their marriage is better than ever. Jenny asks her mother if Elisa can go to the movies with them, but they need to get permission for Betty. Alan is out of town, so Candy goes over to their house and asks Betty if Elisa can go with them to the movies a little later after their kids get out of a summer kids congregation. They gossip a little bit and then Betty tells Candy she is pregnant with her third child. Then out of nowhere, Betty straight up asks Candy if she is having an affair with Alan. Candy initially denies it, but eventually confesses the truth. Betty is hysteric and tries to calm down. She goes to the laundry room and grabs an axe as the episode ends. Episode 4. Do No Evil. Betty tells Candy to leave and never come back into their lives. Candy says she will never see her again after she drops off Elisa after the movies, and she just tries apologizing a little too much, which pisses Betty off even more. Betty pushes her into the laundry room and tries to kill her. She tells Candy she can't have Alan and then attempts to hit her with the axe and grazes her toe. The very next thing we see is Candy coming out of the house dripping wet after taking a shower. She is bleeding from her forehead and limping, but she drives home. She showers and tries to clean all of the clothes that she had on. She also is trying to concoct a story to tell the police when they come snooping around. She goes on with her day trying to pretend like nothing happened and still goes to the movies with Elisa and Jenny. Later that day, Sherry can tell something is up with Candy, but Candy says she is fine. Meanwhile, Alan is trying to call Betty and can't get a hold of her, so he calls his neighbors and asks them to check the house. He also calls Candy and asks her if Betty was fine when she visited her earlier in the day, and Candy says she was there safe and sound when she left. The neighbors get into the house and discover Betty's dead body in the laundry room. They then call Alan to break the news to him, and they tell him she's been murdered. She was struck 41 times with an axe. Alan is heartbroken and breaks the news to Candy, who pretends to be sad. The police investigate it and learn that Candy was the last person to visit Betty alive. The police also believe the murder was not premeditated and the person who committed the crime was a woman due to the footprints found. Alan returns home and has to break the news to Elisa that her mother is dead. The next day in church, Candy asks Don to talk in private and wonders if she should be worried about being a suspect. But he says there's no way anyone thinks she could have done this heinous crime. 41 times with an axe is about as brutal as it gets. Candy is called in for an interrogation and she tells them the story she rehearsed multiple times. The church gathers for Betty's memorial service. The episode closes with Alan being interrogated by the police and he spills the beans that he had an affair with Candy Montgomery. Episode 5. The Arrest. The cops question Alan whether or not he should be a suspect. Candy is then called back in so they can get her fingerprint and also question her about the affair. Candy says the affair has been over for 8 months, so why would she want to hurt Betty? She continues to maintain her innocence. They check her shoe size and also see the cut on her foot. After she leaves, Candy and Pat ask Don to be their attorney if she were to be taken into custody. Don says he knows she didn't do this and will prove it. It's a huge buzz around town and even reporters are asking Candy if she murdered Betty, and Candy doesn't know how to react to the scrutiny. She meets with Don and confesses to doing it, but it was self-defense as Betty was charging at her with an axe. Don says to keep this information private to only them. He is going to bring on another lawyer to help him with such a prolific case. A few days later, Candy and Alan both take polygraph tests and Alan passes his. Don then tells Candy a warrant is out for her arrest with a $100,000 bond. Don brings on criminal defense lawyer Robert Udashin to co-counsel Candy. Candy self-surrenders to the police and she is taken into custody. Alan learns Candy has been arrested and he is thrown back and doesn't think Candy could do such a thing. Candy is released on bond the following morning and Don tells the public they are pleading not guilty and Candy is innocent. Don wants to paint Candy as an innocent petite woman who could never attack someone 41 times with an axe. Pat is right next to Candy through this tough time even though he believes she is guilty too. At the first court hearing, we can tell that Don and this judge do not like each other in the smallest, so it'll be even harder to win over the jury. Don makes Candy start seeing a psychologist as well. The episode closes with Don finally calling and telling Pat the truth about Candy being guilty. Episode 6. The Big Top. The episode starts off 4 months since Betty's murder and Candy is still making appearances around town while her trial lingers, and she has even changed her look, got a new haircut and everything. The jury selection process begins, and out of nowhere, Don comes out and tells the court that Candy did in fact kill Betty Gore, but she was acting in self-defense. Don asks Ron if he will testify in Candy's favor in court, and he agrees. The next hearing arrives, and Judge Tom gets mad that Don went out and made a public plea claiming self-defense when he should have done that a lot earlier. The first person to take the stand is Alan, and he tells the court everything about their affair. Alan says he doesn't know how Betty even found out about it. He also says that there was no reason for Candy to murder Betty because the affair had ended, which makes Candy look a little better to the jury. Betty's father in attendance does not like Alan defending Candy. A few more witnesses take the stand and testify what they saw when they entered the Gore household that fateful day. Don continues to tell Candy to look weak and emotionally distressed in court. The cops and detectives are the next to testify. Don does a good job at explaining the murder wasn't premeditated and things just escalated quickly. Don knows that the prosecutor is saving the pathologist for last to paint Candy in a worse light right before deliberation. When the pathologist does take the stand, he says that Betty's face was so bad, you couldn't even recognize half of her after the attack. He also adds that he concluded Betty had been gashed 40 times before her death and one final time after she was dead to put the nail in the coffin. Don still claims self-defense is the reason. Don then calls his first witness, Candy, to take the stand, who is doped up on medication to help with her anxiety. Episode 7. Shush. Series finale. Don tells Candy to be as vulnerable as possible, and she takes the stand. Candy recounts the incident exactly like we saw it, or at least the part that we did see. Betty tried swinging with the axe, got her foot and head, but then she was able to dodge the other attempts. Candy says she was able to grab the axe from Betty and swung at her out of fear. Something took over and she went to town on Betty. She was afraid that Betty would get back up and kill her, so she kept swinging to make sure Betty stayed down. She then showered in their home to get the blood off of her, and then she left. During cross-examining, the prosecutor brings out the murder weapon to show to the court. He claims Candy is lying because they found a lens to her sunglasses in the garage, so he believes Candy grabbed the axe out of the garage, not Betty. Candy claims it must have fell during their struggle in the laundry room since they are right next to each other. The court seems to be leaning in the prosecutor's favor after this new revelation. Don starts scrambling, and he knows he needs to make a big move or they will lose this case. The following day, Don has Pat take the stand and he blames himself for the affair. But the prosecution chalks this testimony up to Candy being manipulative of Pat. The last witness to take the stand is Dr. Faison, who is Candy's psychologist. Faison claims that Candy had a flashback to her childhood where she was abused, and that caused her to attack Betty after holding in that in all these years. It was like she blacked out and couldn't control it. Faison also believes Candy may suffer from DID as well. He tells the court he doesn't believe Candy knowingly killed Betty that day. The following day are closing arguments for the defense and prosecution. The jury goes into deliberation while Pat and Candy have a meal at home. Candy thanks Pat for sticking by her side. A verdict has been decided, and the jury found Candy not guilty of murdering Betty. Alan is void of any emotion. 8 days later, the Montgomery family moves out of Wiley to start off new after Candy apologizes to Alan for everything. The final credits show that Candy and Pat actually divorced not long after moving to Georgia, and Alan Gore was married multiple times the rest of his life. Candy now works as a therapist in Georgia alongside her daughter Jenny. And that is For Love and Death. We'll probably do the series Candy next, which is another series based on the same story, so I hope you can check that one out too when I get it uploaded and compare the two. Thanks for watching.